Welcome back to Cowboy Ironheart, friends. If this is your first time sitting ve kep ite hadas by the fire, pull up a chair, because tonight's story is one that's going to wrap itself around your heart and refuse to let go. It's called She Finally Stopped Counting the Days, the tale of a lonely, full-figured widow and the giant cowboy who quietly taught her how to live again. For 2 long years, Bernadette had counted every single day since the telegram came telling her she was a widow. Every sunrise, she opened that little worn leather journal and made another careful mark. The numbers kept her grief alive, kept her from forgetting, kept the emptiness from swallowing her whole. She told herself she would count forever. Then one quiet evening on the train heading west as a mail-order bride, Bernadette realized with a start that she had forgotten to count. For the first time in 2 years, an entire day had slipped by without her noticing, and it was because of him. When the stagecoach finally rolled into the dusty town of Willow Creek in the Montana Territory, Bernadette stepped down feeling small and uncertain despite her full, soft figure. The wind tugged at Moatfee, her dark navy dress that hugged her ample curves, and she smoothed it nervously, aware of how different she looked from the slender women around her. Waiting for her on the boardwalk was Everett. The moment her eyes found him, her breath caught. He was a true giant, well over 6.5 feet tall with a massive, powerful build that made every other man look small. Broad shoulders blocked the late afternoon sun, thick arms rested at his sides, and those steel-gray eyes looked straight at her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size. He walked toward her slowly, boots heavy on the wooden planks, as if he knew how intimidating he could be. When he stopped in front of her, he had to look down quite a ways to meet her gaze. In that deep, rumbling voice, he said simply that he was Everett, that he was glad she had come all this way, and that her home was ready whenever she was. He didn't stare at her curves or make her feel out of place. He just looked at her like she was exactly what he had been waiting for. In that single moment, something deep inside Bernadette shifted. She didn't know it yet, but the counting had already begun to fade. If you're already feeling that first quiet pull in your chest the way Mort am right now, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Cowboy Ironheart. We're only just beginning with Bernadette and Everett, and the road ahead is full of the kind of slow, healing moments that stay with you long after the fire dies down. Everett stood there on the boardwalk, his massive frame casting a long shadow that seemed to wrap around Bernadette like a protective wall. She felt every soft curve of her full figure under that dark navy dress, the way the fabric hugged her ample bosom and rounded belly, the way her wide hips shifted as she stood there uncertain. Back in Philadelphia, men had looked at her ve kepite, had pity or worse. But Everett's steel-gray eyes held nothing but steady kindness. He didn't stare, he simply saw her. "The wagon's right over there, ma'am," he said in that deep, rumbling voice that rolled across the dusty street like distant thunder, softened by distance. "Your trunk looks heavy. Let me take it." Before she could even form a protest, one of those enormous arms reached down. His hand, big enough to span her waist if he wanted, closed around the handle of her steamer trunk and lifted it as easily as if it were an empty flour sack. The muscles in his shoulder and back flexed under the dark blue flannel. But there was no strain on his face, no grunt, just quiet strength. Bernadette's breath caught. She had never seen a man move like that, so big yet so careful, as if he understood that some things, including her, needed to be handled gently. He turned back to her and offered his other arm, elbow bent, waiting. "May Moat help you up?" She placed her smaller hand on his forearm. The heat of his skin through the rolled-up sleeves surprised her, solid and warm like sun-baked earth. When she stepped onto the wagon wheel for leverage, Everett's free hand came to rest lightly at the small of her back, steadying her without pressing, without lingering in any way that made her feel self-conscious about her soft, full body. He lifted her the last bit as she settled onto the wooden seat, and for a moment she was eye-level with him while he stood on the ground. The size difference hit her all over again. He was a giant, easily 2 feet taller than her even when she was seated. Yet he looked up at her with such quiet respect that her cheeks warmed. The wagon creaked when he climbed up beside her. The bench shifted under his weight, tilting slightly toward him, and Bernadette had to brace herself so she didn't slide against his massive thigh. He noticed and reached behind the seat, pulling out a thick wool blanket. "Prairie wind can bite this time of evening," he said simply, and draped it across her lap and over her knees with those huge hands moving so carefully it was like watching a bear handle a butterfly. Then he picked up the reins, gave the 2 sturdy horses a soft click, and they started rolling out of Willow Creek. The town faded behind them, the boardwalks and false front buildings giving way to wide-open grassland that stretched toward the distant mountains. The sun was low, painting everything in gold and rose, and the wind carried the sharp scent of sage and pine. Bernadette kept her hands folded in her lap under the blanket, the little leather journal she had carried for 2 years tucked safely in her carpet bag at her feet. She hadn't opened it once since stepping off the stagecoach. That realization settled over her like the blanket itself, warm and a little frightening. Everett didn't push for talk at first. He let the silence stretch between them, comfortable as an old saddle. But after a few miles, he glanced sideways and spoke again, voice low so it wouldn't startle her. "Mut know this ain't what you pictured when you answered the advertisement. A cabin way out here, no neighbors for miles, just me and the cattle in the mountains. But Mut meant what Mut said back in town. Your home is ready. Mut built it with my own hands so it would be sturdy, safe." Bernadette looked up at him, studying the strong line of his jaw under the dark beard, the way his thick hair curled just a little at the collar. "Mut day note come expecting a mansion, Mr. Everett. Mut came because the days were starting to feel too long and too empty back east. Mut thought maybe out here Mut could stop counting them." He gave a slow nod, eyes on the road ahead. "Mut ka know ve kept something about counting days. Lost my own folks young, then my brother to a cattle stampede 5 years back. Spent a lot of nights thinking the silence would swallow me whole. Then Mort put the ad in the paper and hoped someone might come who understood that kind of quiet." The wagon hit a gentle dip and Bernadette swayed. Instinctively, Everett's arm came out, his big hand resting lightly on her shoulder for just a second to steady her. The touch was brief, respectful, but she felt the strength in it, the way those powerful fingers could have crushed but chose only to support. Her heart gave a strange little flutter. No one had touched her with such protective care in years. They rode on as the light faded. He pointed out landmarks in that same quiet rumble. The stand of cottonwoods where the creek ran year-round, the ridge where elk liked to graze at dusk, the distant peak he called Sentinel Mountain because it watched over the whole valley. Bernadette found herself listening, not just to the words, but to the man saying them. There was no boast in his voice, only a deep love for the land and a willingness to share it with her. When they finally crested the last hill, the homestead came into view. A solid log cabin with a wide front porch, smoke curling from the stone chimney, and a sturdy barn off to the side. Lantern light glowed soft in the windows. It looked like something built to last through blizzards and loneliness both. Everett pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down. This time he didn't just offer his arm. He reached up, placed those massive hands at her waist, and lifted her down as if she weighed nothing at all. Her full curves pressed briefly against his broad chest before her feet touched the ground, and for that single heartbeat she felt small and safe in a way she had never known. He set her down gently and stepped back right away, giving her space, but his eyes stayed on her face. "Supper's waiting inside," he said. "Mot put on a stew this morning before Mot left, figured you to be hungry after the long ride. If it's not to your liking, Mot can fix something else." Bernadette followed him up the porch steps. The door was built tall and wide, made for a man his size, and when he pushed it open, the warmth of the cabin rolled out to meet her, smelling of wood smoke, fresh bread, and slow-cooked beef. A big table sat in the center with 2 chairs, one ordinary and one clearly built extra sturdy. The bed in the corner was made up with clean quilts, and there was even a little curtained corner for privacy. He helped her out of her coat, hanging it on a peg beside his own heavy canvas duster. Then he pulled out the smaller chair for her. When she sat, the way he towered over the table made the whole room feel intimate instead of overwhelming. He ladled stew into 2 bowls, set one in front of her, and took his own seat. The chair groaned a little under his weight, but held. They ate in companionable quiet for a while. The stew was rich and savory, the bread warm and crusty. After a few spoonfuls, Bernadette found her voice again. "It's very good, thank you." Everett's steel-gray eyes softened at the corners. "Glad to hear it. Mot don't cook fancy, but Mot cook plenty. Figure a woman with your generous spirit needs a man who can keep the larder full." He said it so matter-of-factly, without any hidden jab at her size, that tears pricked at her eyes. He noticed and set his spoon down. Did Mot say something wrong? She shook her head, smiling through the sudden emotion. "No, it's just, most men back home made me feel like Mot took up too much space. You make me feel like there's plenty of room for me here." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth. "There is more than enough room, Bernadette. This land is big. This cabin is solid. And Mot met big enough to stand between you and anything that tries to tell you different." Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the pines, but inside the fire crackled and the lantern light painted everything golden. Bernadette looked at the giant man across from her, at the way his massive shoulders filled the space, yet his presence felt like shelter. For the first time in 2 years, the ache in her chest felt a little smaller. She hadn't reached for her journal once, since stepping off that stagecoach, and as Everett stood to clear the dishes, moving with that surprising grace for a man his size, she realized she still hadn't counted the day. That night the wind outside picked up, rattling the shutters like it wanted to remind them both how far from everything they were. Bernadette helped clear the table, even though Everett tried to wave her off. She watched him move around the cabin, those massive shoulders filling the space between the stove and the sink, his big hands handling the iron skillet as if it were made of eggshell. When she reached for a dish, he gently took it from her and said, "You've had a long day of traveling. Sit, let me do this." His voice was low, almost shy, like he was afraid of sounding bossy. She sat anyway, but not because she was tired. Because the way he looked at her, like her presence in his kitchen was already a gift, made something warm bloom behind her ribs. Later, they moved to the 2 rocking chairs by the stone fireplace. Everett had built the fire up high, and the flames painted dancing light across the log walls. Bernadette tucked her feet under her full skirt, aware of how the fabric stretched across her soft thighs and rounded belly. But Everett never once let his eyes linger in a way that made her feel heavy or out of place. He simply sat there, his enormous frame making the sturdy chair look almost delicate, and stared into the fire like he was giving her time to settle. After a long, quiet stretch, she found herself speaking. "My husband, he was a good man. Clerk in a shipping office back in Philadelphia. Never raised his voice, never made me feel anything but safe in our little row house. When the fever took him, Mot thought the world ended right there with him. 2 years Mot counted every day. Like if Mot stopped, the grief would disappear and Mot D be forgetting him. But tonight Mot reached for that journal even once." Everett nodded slowly, the firelight catching the silver threads just starting to show in his dark beard. "Grief's a strange thing, it don't let go easy. My brother was the last family Mot had. We ran this place together, till that stampede. After he was gone, Mot near tore the barn down with my bare hands one night. Thought if Mot worked hard enough, the pain would wear out. Didn't he, just left me emptier. Then Mot wrote that advertisement. Figured maybe there was someone out there who knew what it was to carry a weight like that and still want to keep living." Bernadette looked at him then, really looked, at the way his massive chest rose and fell under the flannel shirt, at the powerful forearms resting on his thighs, at the sheer size of him that should have made her feel afraid, but instead made the cabin feel like the safest place on earth. "You re a big man, Everett, in every way. Most men your size Mo've seen in town, they carry it like a threat. You carry it like a promise." He turned those steel gray eyes on her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something deeper than kindness. Something that looked a lot like longing. "Never wanted to be the kind of man who scared folks, especially not you. When Mot read your letter, the one where you told me plain about your size and your sorrow, Mot kanoave kept right then. Mot wanted the woman who was brave enough to say those things. Not some picture-perfect vision. Mot wanted real." Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Back east, her curves had been something to apologize for, something to hide under corsets and dark colors. Here, in this cabin with a giant who could have lifted her with one hand, she felt seen, wanted. She blinked back the sudden sting in her eyes and managed a small smile. "Well, you've got the real thing now. All 240 pounds of her, give or take what the journey shook loose." Everett's mouth curved into the faintest smile, the first she'd seen. It transformed his rugged face, softening the hard lines. "Then Mot reckon Mot lug, just have to make sure there's plenty of good food in the larder. Can have my mail-order bride wasting away on these Montana winds." He said it so lightly, so teasing yet so tender, that she laughed out loud, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. They sat like that until the fire burned low. When it was time for bed, he showed her the curtain corner he fixed up just for her, a narrow but comfortable cot vey kep. Tehat fresh linens and an extra quilt. "Mort sleep over there by the door," he said, pointing to a larger bed against the far wall. "Figured you'd want your own space at first until you decide different." He didn't push, did even hint. Just gave her privacy and a quiet good night before turning away. Bernadette lay under the quilt, listening to the wind and the soft creak of the cabin as it settled. She could hear Everett moving around, the floorboards groaning under his weight, the rustle as he banked the fire. His presence was everywhere, even when he wasn't looking at her. She pressed a hand to her soft belly, feeling the familiar roundness, and for the first time in forever it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like part of her that he had already accepted. Morning came with the smell of coffee and bacon. Bernadette woke to the sound of Everett moving quietly so as not to disturb her. When she stepped out from behind the curtain, dressed in a simpler calico work dress that still hugged her full figure, he was already at the stove. He turned and his eyes warmed instantly. "Mornin'. Hope you slept some." "Better than Mort have in months," she admitted. He nodded like that was the best news he'd heard all year. After breakfast, he took her outside to show her the homestead properly. The sun was bright and the air crisp with that high mountain bite. Everett walked beside her, slowing his long stride so she didn't have to hurry. When they reached a muddy patch near the chicken coop, he didn't hesitate. He simply scooped her up in his arms like she weighed no more than a sack of feathers. One massive arm under her knees, the other around her back, her ample bosom and soft hips pressed against his hard chest. Bernadette gasped, her hands flying to his shoulders for balance. "Easy now," he murmured against her hair. "Ground slick after last night's rain. Don't want you slipping." He carried her the 20 feet across the mud, set her down gently on dry grass, and stepped back immediately, giving her space. But his hands lingered a second longer than necessary on her waist, steady and warm. There, safe and sound. She stood there, flushed, heart hammering, feeling the ghost of his strength around her. "You didn't have to do that." "Mot ka no vi kep," he said simply, but Mot wanted to. He showed her the barn next, the 2 milk cows that looked small beside him, the dozen laying hens, the small garden plot he'd already turned over for spring planting. When a loose board on the fence caught her skirt and she stumbled, Everett was there in an instant, one huge hand catching her elbow, the other steadying her shoulder. "Got you," he said, voice low and sure. She looked up at him, all 6 feet 10 inches of protective muscle, and felt tears threaten again. No one had ever moved so fast to keep her from falling. They spent the morning working side by side. Everett mended the fence while Bernadette fed the chickens. She watched the way his powerful back flexed under the flannel, the way sweat darkened the fabric between his shoulder blades. Yet every time he glanced her way, it was hat that same gentle watchfulness. When the sun climbed higher, he insisted she sit in the shade of the porch with a cool drink of water from the well. He brought it to her himself, the tin cup looking tiny in his big hand. "You re-spoiling me already," she teased as she took it. His steel gray eyes crinkled at the corners. "Been waiting 2 months for you to get here. Figure Mort got some catching up to do." In the afternoon, he took her riding, or tried to. He saddled a gentle mare for her and helped her up, his hand spanning her waist completely as he lifted her into the saddle. Once she was settled, he mounted his own big draft horse, the animal looking ordinary beneath his massive frame. They rode slow along the creek, the water sparkling under the sun, and Everett pointed out the places where wildflowers would bloom soon, where the deer came to drink at dusk. Bernadette felt the rhythm of the horse under her, felt the wind tugging at her thick chestnut braid, and realized she hadn't thought about counting days once since waking. As they rode, he asked her questions, real ones. What kind of books she liked back east, whether she missed the city noise or the church bells, what her favorite pie was so he could try to learn the recipe. She answered honestly, voice growing softer as the trust between them deepened. When she told him about the long, lonely evenings after her husband died, how she'd sit by the window watching the street lamps come on and feel invisible, Everett listened without interrupting. Then he shared how after his brother passed, he'd gone weeks without speaking more than 10 words a day, how the silence had almost broken him until he decided to reach out for a wife. "You're not invisible here, Bernadette," he said as they turned the horses back toward the cabin. "Not to me. Never could be." The sun was setting by the time they returned, painting the mountains in fiery orange and purple. Everett helped her down from the mare again, lifting her effortlessly, holding her just a moment longer this time so her feet touched the ground slow and steady. She stayed close to his chest, a heartbeat longer than necessary, breathing in the scent of him, leather and wood smoke and honest sweat. When she stepped back, her cheeks were warm. Inside he cooked again, this time a simple supper of fried potatoes, venison steaks he'd smoked himself, and biscuits light enough to melt on the tongue. They ate at the big table, knees almost brushing under it because of how much space he took up. After the dishes were done, they sat by the fire once more, but tonight the silence felt different, fuller, like something was growing in it. Bernadette gathered her courage and reached out, placing her smaller hand on his forearm. The muscle there was like warm iron under her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for making me feel like I belong." Everett turned his hand over and gently closed his fingers around hers. His palm swallowed hers completely, yet the touch was feather light. "You do belong, Bernadette, right here, With me. However long it takes for you to believe it. Outside the night wind sang through the pines, but inside the cabin the fire crackled, and two hearts beat a little closer than they had the night before. Bernadette looked at the giant man holding her hand so carefully and realized the journal in her carpet bag had been opened all day. Not once. The days were no longer something she needed to count. They were something she was finally ready to live. And somewhere in the quiet between them, the slow, steady burn of something beautiful had just begun to glow brighter. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm that felt both new and strangely familiar, like a song Bernadette had forgotten she once knew the words to. Each morning she woke to the low rumble of Everett moving about the cabin, trying to be quiet so he wouldn't disturb her, though his sighs made the floorboards protest no matter how softly he stepped. She would step out from behind her curtained corner in her simple calico dress, the fabric stretching comfortably over her full bosom and rounded belly, and find him already at the stove, coffee brewing strong and black the way he liked it. He would turn those steel-gray eyes toward her, the faintest smile touching the corners of his mouth under the dark beard, and say good morning like it was the most important part of his day. On the third morning, she insisted on helping with breakfast. Mott met not here to be waited on, Everett, she told him firmly, rolling up her sleeves so the soft flesh of her arms showed. Back in Philadelphia, Mott kept a house and cooked for two. Let me earn my keep. He watched her for a long moment, as if measuring whether she really meant it, then stepped aside with a nod. She moved around him in the small kitchen space, aware of how his massive frame filled so much of it, how her own generous curves brushed against the table when she reached for the flour tin. When she needed the heavy iron skillet from the high shelf, Everett didn't let her stretch. He simply reached over her head with one enormous arm, bringing it down and placing it on the stove with no effort at all. His chest was so close behind her that she could feel the heat of him through her dress, solid and warm like a living wall. "Thank you," she whispered, and he only grunted softly, but she caught the way his hand hovered near her shoulder for a second before he pulled back, always giving her room. They cooked side by side after that, her directing him on how to roll the biscuit dough just right while he chopped the thick slices of bacon with his big knife. The kitchen filled with the smell of sizzling meat and fresh coffee, and for the first time in years Bernadette felt useful, wanted part of something instead of watching life from the edges. Everett never once made her feel slow or cumbersome. When she had to bend to check the oven, her wide hips pressing against the counter, he simply moved the bench closer so she could sit and rest her feet. "No sense wearing yourself out," he said in that deep, rolling voice. "We've got all day." After breakfast, they fell into a pattern of morning chores. Everett would head to the barn to milk the cows and tend the horses, his broad shoulders disappearing through the wide doorway he'd built himself. Bernadette took over the chickens and the garden plot, her full figure moving veille-kept hat, a surprising grace as she scattered feed and pulled early weeds. The Montana sun was kind that week, warm enough to chase the last chill from the air, but not yet harsh. She loved the way the wind tugged at Motfi her thick chestnut braid, the way the earth felt solid under her button boots. One afternoon, while she was kneeling in the garden, her rounded belly resting comfortably on her thighs, a sudden gust knocked her off balance. She started to tip sideways into the soft dirt, but Everett was there before she could even gasp. He had crossed the yard in 3 long strides, those powerful legs eating up the distance, and his huge hands caught her under the arms, lifting her gently to her feet as if she were made of thistledown instead of 240 pounds of soft womanly curves. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice so close to her ear that she felt the vibration in her chest. His hands spanned her waist completely, thumbs resting just beneath her bosom, steady and sure. For a heartbeat they stood like that, her back against his massive chest, his chin nearly resting on the top of her head because of how much taller he was. She could feel every inch of his strength holding her without squeezing, protecting, without smothering. Grounds still soft from the thaw. "Donna wants you getting muddy." He set her down carefully but didn't step away right away. Instead, he brushed a bit of dirt from her sleeve with those big fingers, touch feather light. "You all right?" Bernadette looked up at him, heart hammering against her ribs. "Mot am now," she said softly. "You always seem to be there when Mot need catching, Everett." His steel-gray eyes held hers for a long moment, something deep and warm flickering in them. "Plan on being there every time," he answered simply, then cleared his throat and went back to his fence mending, but she saw the way his ears had gone a little red under the dark hair. That evening after supper they sat on the wide front porch together, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. Everett had brought out an extra wide rocking chair he'd built years ago for himself, but tonight he insisted she take it. While he sat on the steps, his long legs stretched out so his boots rested in the grass. The size difference between them had never felt more striking or more comforting. She rocked gently, her full skirt pooling around her thick thighs, while he looked out over the land that was now theirs together. The silence between them was easy now, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "You ever miss the city?" he asked after a while, voice low like he didn't want to break the peace. Bernadette thought about it, fingers tracing the smooth wood of the chair arm. Sometimes Mut missed the church bells on Sunday mornings or the way the street lamps looked in the rain, but mostly Mut missed feeling like Mut belonged somewhere. After my husband passed, the house felt too big and too empty at the same time. People looked at Motfimi and saw a widow who took up space. They didn't see me. She paused, then added quietly, "Out here you look at me and Mot feel. Seen, really seen." Everett turned his head, those piercing eyes catching the last of the sunset. "That is because Mot do see you, Bernadette. All of you. The way your eyes light up when you talk about baking. The way you hum when you re-feeding the chickens. The way your body moves soft and strong at the same time. Back when Mot read your letter, Mot knew Mot wanted a woman who was real, not some fragile thing that would break in the first hard winter. I wanted someone who could stand beside me, curves and all, and make this place a home." Her breath caught at the honesty in his words. No man had ever spoken of her full figure with such open admiration. She felt tears prick at her eyes again, but this time they were happy ones. "You make me feel beautiful, Everett. Even when Mort met covered in garden dirt and my dress is straining at the seams." He reached up from where he sat on the steps and laid his enormous hand over hers on the chair arm. His palm swallowed her fingers completely, warm and calloused from years of work, yet so incredibly gentle. "You are beautiful," he said, the words rumbling out like distant thunder wrapped in velvet. "Every soft in of you, and Mort met grateful you trusted me enough to come all this way." They stayed like that until the stars came out, his hand resting over hers, the night air cool and sweet with pine. When it was time to go inside, he stood and offered her his arm, but instead of just steadying her, he scooped her up again, carrying her across the threshold like she weighed nothing. "Porch steps can be tricky in the dark," he explained, though they both knew the real reason. She rested her cheek against his broad shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, and let herself be held for those few precious seconds before he set her down inside. The next week brought the first real test of their new life together. A late spring storm rolled in from the mountains, dark clouds piling up like angry giants themselves. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters. Everett had reinforced ve kepatehat extra iron. Rain came down in sheets, turning the yard into a sea of mud. Bernadette worried about the chickens in the garden, but Everett wouldn't let her go out. "Stay inside where it's dry," he told her, already pulling on his heavy canvas duster. "Motluglunk see to the animals." But she wouldn't hear of it. "We re-in this together now," she said, wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders. "Two pairs of hands are better than one, even if one pair is as big as yours." He looked at her for a long moment, pride and worry warring in his eyes, then nodded. They went out together, him carrying the lantern high while she held on to his arm. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet more than once, her full body swaying. But Everett simply wrapped one massive arm around her waist and pulled her against his side, sheltering her completely from the worst of it. She fit perfectly under his arm, her soft curves pressed to his hard muscle, her head barely reaching his chest. He kept her steady all the way to the barn, boots sinking deep in the mud while hers barely touched the ground. Inside the barn, the animals were restless but safe. They worked quickly, spreading fresh straw and making sure the cows had water. When they were done and the storm was howling louder than ever, Everett looked down at her, rain dripping from his dark hair. "You re-soaked through," he said, voice rough with concern. Without asking, he lifted her again, carrying her back to the cabin in long, sure strides. This time he didn't set her down right away. He carried her straight to the fireplace, lowered her into the rocking chair, and knelt in front of her. His huge hands worked the wet laces of her boots, peeling them off gently. Then he fetched a thick towel and dried her feet, her ankles, even the hem of her skirt where it clung to her thick thighs. The touch was so caring, so intimate, that Bernadette's cheeks burned hotter than the fire he was stoking back to life. "You didn't have to come out there," he said quietly while he worked, "but Mortmet glad you did. Makes this place feel more like ours." She reached down and touched his beard, the first time she'd have been brave enough to initiate contact like that. "Motve kepa no teet to be ours, Everett. All of it. The good days and the stormy ones." He looked up at her then, kneeling there like a giant paying homage to his queen, and something in his steel-gray eyes shifted. The longing was clearer now, deeper. He rose slowly, towering over her, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he cupped her face in both enormous hands, thumbs brushing her plump cheeks with infinite tenderness. "We rebuilding something here, Bernadette, day by day, and would aim to keep you safe through every one of them." The storm raged outside for 2 more days, but inside the cabin they stayed warm and dry. They played cards at the big table, her smaller hand disappearing inside his when he dealt. She taught him how to make her late husband's favorite apple pie, using the last of the dried fruit from the larder, and he watched her every move like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. When the pie came out of the oven golden and fragrant, he took the first bite and closed his eyes in pure pleasure. "Best thing Motviv tasted in years," he said, and the way he looked at her made her wonder if he meant more than just the pie. On the 3rd night, the rain finally eased to a soft drizzle. They sat by the fire again. Closer this time, her chair pulled right beside his. Bernadette found herself leaning against his massive arm, the solid warmth of him like a living shield. She told him more about her marriage, the quiet happiness she'd had before the fever, and he shared stories of his brother, the laughter they'd shared working this land together. The grief was still there, but it no longer felt sharp enough to cut. It was softening, making room for something new. When she yawned, sleepy from the long day, Everett stood and lifted her once more, carrying her to her curtained corner. This time he didn't leave right away. He tucked the quilt around her full figure with those careful hands, then brushed a stray lock of chestnut hair from her forehead. "Sleep well," he whispered. "Moat met right over there if you need anything. Anything at all." She caught his hand before he could pull away. "Stay a minute," she said softly. He knelt beside the cot, his huge frame making the space feel small and safe. They stayed like that, hands linked, until her eyes grew heavy. The last thing she felt before sleep claimed her was the gentle press of his lips against her knuckles, so light she almost thought she'd dreamed it. Outside, the drizzle whispered against the roof, but inside 2 hearts beat in quiet harmony. Bernadette hadn't opened her little leather journal in days now. The counting had stopped completely, replaced by something far sweeter, the slow, steady unfolding of trust, of desire, of a love big enough to match the giant man who had come into her life and made her feel cherished exactly as she was, soft curves, tender heart, and all. And with every protective touch, every quiet word, every shared sunrise on their Montana homestead, that love grew stronger, deeper, ready to bloom fully when the time was right. The weeks after the storm brought warmer days and a new kind of closeness to the homestead that neither Bernadette nor Everett had expected so soon. Spring unfurled across the Montana Valley like a promise kept, painting the hills in soft greens and wildflowers that danced in the breeze. The mud dried, the creek ran clear and fast, and the garden plot Bernadette had worried over began pushing up tender shoots of carrots and beans. Every morning she stepped out onto the porch in her calico dress, the fabric now comfortably worn, and hugging every generous curve of her full figure, and she would find Everett already at work, his massive frame moving with that quiet purpose that made her heart feel steady. He had taken to leaving a fresh tin cup of coffee on the porch rail for her, exactly the way she liked it, with a spoonful of sugar and a splash of cream from the morning milking. When she joined him in the garden, he never hurried her. Instead, he worked on his knees beside her, his enormous hands gentle with the soil, while hers, smaller and softer, patted it firm around the young plants. The size difference between them was impossible to ignore out there in the open air. Everett's broad shoulders cast a long shadow over her as she knelt, her rounded belly resting comfortably on her thick thighs, her ample bosom straining just a little against the bodice of her dress when she reached forward. Yet he never made her feel small in a bad way. He made her feel sheltered. One bright afternoon, while they were thinning the carrot rows, a sudden gust of wind caught her wide-brimmed sunbonnet and sent it tumbling across the yard toward the creek. Bernadette laughed and started after it, her full hips swaying as she hurried, but the ground was still uneven from the rains, and she stumbled on a hidden root. Before she could even gasp, Everett was there. In 2 powerful strides, he closed the distance, one massive arm scooping around her waist and lifting her clean off her feet, so her button boots dangled inches above the grass. Her soft body pressed fully against his hard chest, every curve of her molding to the solid wall of muscle beneath his flannel shirt. He held her there for a heartbeat, steady as a mountain, then set her down gently on level ground and fetched the bonnet himself with one long reach. "You all right?" he asked, voice low and rough with concern as he placed the bonnet back on her head, his big fingers careful with the ribbon under her chin. Bernadette's cheeks were flushed, not just from the sun. Modem now. Seems like you were always catching me before I fall, Everett. His steel-gray eyes softened at the corners, plan on keeping it that way. He didn't step back right away. Instead, he let his hand linger, thumb brushing a stray lock of her thick chestnut hair behind her ear. The touch was so tender it made her breath catch. For a moment they stood like that in the garden, the scent of turned earth and wild sage around them, her full figure still close enough to feel the heat rolling off his massive body. Then he cleared his throat and returned to the carrots. But she saw the way his ears had gone red again, the way his hands moved a little slower, like he was thinking about something else entirely. That evening after supper they sat on the porch again, the sky painted in streaks of pink and gold. Everett had brought out his old harmonica, something he hadn't played in years, and he coaxed a soft, lonesome tune from it, while Bernadette rocked gently in the wide chair. The music wrapped around them like the evening breeze, and when he finished she clapped softly, her eyes shining. That was beautiful. Mot day not know you could play. He shrugged those enormous shoulders, looking almost shy. My brother taught me. Said a man needs something gentle in his hands after a long day of hard work. He set the harmonica aside and looked at her, really looked, taking in the way the sunset light caught the soft roundness of her cheeks, the generous swell of her bosom rising and falling with each breath. You make me want to remember the gentle things again, Bernadette. You make this place feel like home instead of just a cabin mort built to keep the loneliness out. She reached over and placed her hand on his forearm, her fingers barely spanning the thick muscle there. You make me feel the same. Back east, Mot spent 2 years counting days because Mot was afraid if Mot stopped, Mot Didi disappear. Here with you, Mot Met, starting to feel like Mot Met finally visible again. Like every soft inch of me belongs right here on this land, beside a man big enough to hold all of me without breaking. Everett turned his hand, palm up, and closed his fingers around hers, swallowing her hand completely, yet holding it vekepate hat, such care it brought tears to her eyes. You belong here more than you know. Mot read your letter 100 times before you came, the one where you told me plain about your size and your sorrow, and how you hoped for a real life out west. Mot wanted you before, Mot ever saw you, Bernadette. And now that you re-here, Mot wants you even more, all of you. The way you laugh when the chickens peck at your skirt, the way your body moves warm and strong when you work beside me, the way you look at me like Mot Met, not just some giant who scares folks in town. The confession hung between them in the gathering dusk, quiet and honest. Bernadette felt her heart swell until it pressed against her ribs. She leaned a little closer, her shoulder brushing his massive arm, and whispered, Mot want you too, Everett. Mot want this life we rebuilding, one day at a time, without counting anymore. He didn't kiss her that night, though she could see the longing in his steel-gray eyes. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a slow, warm kiss to her knuckles, the same way he had after the storm. Then he carried her inside when the air grew cool, his arms cradling her full weight like it was the easiest, most natural thing in the world. He tucked her into her cot behind the curtain with the same careful hands that could split logs or gentle a spooked horse, and he lingered just long enough for her to feel safe before he went to his own bed by the door. The next days brought more of that quiet growing together. They rode out together to check the far pasture where his cattle grazed, Everett on his big draft horse and Bernadette on the gentle mare he had chosen just for her. He stayed close the whole time, one massive hand ready to steady her if the mare shied at a rabbit or a sudden gust. When they stopped by the creek to water the horses, he helped her down, his hand spanning her waist completely as he lifted her, then kept his arm around her while they walked along the bank. Her thick thighs brushed his leg vekepte hat every step, and she felt no shame in it, only a warm sense of being exactly where she was meant to be. One afternoon, a black bear wandered too close to the chicken coop, drawn by the scent of grain. Bernadette was outside hanging laundry when she heard the low growl. She froze, her full figure silhouetted against the white sheets, heart hammering. The bear was big, shaggy, and far too interested in the hens. Before she could even call out, Everett came thundering from the barn like a force of nature. His boots pounded the ground, his massive frame moving faster than any man that size had a right to. He grabbed the heavy rifle from the porch without breaking stride, then placed himself between her and the bear in one fluid motion, his broad back a living wall in front of her. Stay behind me, he said, voice calm but edged with steel. One enormous arm reached back and pulled her flush against him, tucking her soft curves completely into the shelter of his body. She felt every inch of his power, the way his muscles tensed under the flannel, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek as she pressed her face to his shoulder. The bear reared up, roaring, but Everett stood his ground, tall and unyielding, the rifle steady in his huge hands. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound cracking across the yard like thunder. The bear dropped to all fours and lumbered off into the trees, deciding the giant man protecting his woman wasn't worth the trouble. Everett didn't lower the rifle until the bear was long gone. Then he turned and pulled Bernadette into his arms, fully both massive hands rubbing slow circles on her back as she trembled against him. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "Mot've got you. Nothing's going to touch you while Mot met here. Not bears, not storms, not anything." She clung to him, her arms barely able to circle his thick chest, her ample bosom pressed tight to his ribs, and she felt safer than she had in her entire life. "You were so fast," she whispered, "so big and strong and still so careful with me." He tilted her chin up with one gentle finger, his steel gray eyes searching hers. "Because you were worth being careful with, Bernadette. Every soft, beautiful inch of you." His thumb brushed her plump lower lip, and for a long moment they stood there in the yard with the laundry flapping softly around them, the air thick with everything they hadn't said yet. That night, the tension between them hummed like the strings of a fiddle. After supper, Everett built the fire higher than usual, and they sat together on the wide bench he had pulled close to the hearth. Bernadette leaned into his side without thinking, her head resting against his shoulder, because it felt like the most natural place in the world. His arm came around her, heavy and warm, his hand resting on the curve of her hip as if it belonged there. They talked for hours about small things and big things, about the children they might raise one day if God was kind, about the way the mountains looked at first light, about how loneliness had shaped them both into people who could recognize a real home when it finally arrived. When the fire burned low, he carried her to bed again, but this time he didn't leave immediately. He knelt beside her cot, his huge frame filling the little curtained space, and brushed her thick chestnut braid over her shoulder. "Met falling for you, Bernadette," he said simply, the words rumbling out like distant thunder wrapped in velvet. "Have been since the moment you stepped off that stagecoach and looked up at me without fear. Moat wants you to know that. Moat wants you to feel it every day until you ready to hear the rest of what's in my heart." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she was smiling. She cupped his bearded jaw in Beote hat hands, feeling the strength there and the gentleness he gave only to her. "Mot met already yours, Everett. Mot stopped counting the days the moment Mot met you. Now Mot met just counting the ways Mot loved being here with you." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and pressed his forehead to hers. Their breaths mingled, warm and steady, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to just the two of them, giant man and full-figured woman, wrapped in the quiet promise of something forever. He didn't kiss her lips that night either. He waited, honoring the slow burn they had both come to cherish. Instead, he kissed her forehead, then her temple, then the corner of her mouth with such tenderness it stole the air from her lungs. When he finally rose and left her to sleep, Bernadette lay under the quilt, feeling her heart full to bursting. Outside, the night wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of new grass and mountain wildflowers. Inside the cabin, a giant cowboy banked the fire and stretched out on his bed, a small smile on his rugged face, as he thought of the woman whose soft curves and stronger spirit had healed the empty places inside him. The love between them was no longer just beginning to glow. It was growing roots deep into the Montana soil, spreading wide and strong like the arms of the man who had lifted her, protected her, and taught her that she was perfect exactly as she was. And with every sunrise they shared, every protective touch, every quiet confession whispered by firelight, Bernadette and Everett moved closer to the day when words would no longer be enough and the giant cowboy would finally claim his mail-order bride in the way. Both their hearts had been waiting for all along. The love between them was no longer just beginning to glow. It was growing roots deep into the Montana soil, spreading wide and strong like the arms of the man who had lifted her, protected her, and taught her that she was perfect exactly as she was. And with every sunrise they shared, every protective touch, every quiet confession whispered by firelight, Bernadette and Everett moved closer to the day when words would no longer be enough. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that made the whole valley feel alive and hopeful. Bernadette woke to the now familiar sound of Everett moving about the cabin, his heavy boots careful on the floorboards so as not to wake her. She dressed quickly in her favorite calico, the soft fabric hugging her ample bosom and rounded belly with familiar comfort, then stepped out from behind the curtain. He was at the stove again, broad back to her, the muscles shifting under his flannel shirt as he turned the bacon. When he heard her, he glanced over his shoulder, and that faint smile touched his lips, the one that always made her stomach flutter. "Mornin'," he rumbled, voice still rough with sleep. "Coffee poured. Figured we'd ride into Willow Creek today if you re-up for it. Need supplies." And Mott thought, maybe you'd like to pick out some fabric for new curtains. Place could use a woman's touch. Bernadette's heart lifted at the idea. She had not been back to town since the day she arrived, and the thought of stepping into the general store on Everett S. Arm filled her with a quiet excitement. "Molt like that very much," she said, moving to stand beside him. Even on her tiptoes, she barely reached his shoulder. He noticed and reached the sugar tin down for her without being asked, his enormous arm brushing lightly against her as he did. The casual closeness sent a warm shiver through her full figure. They ate breakfast together at the big table, knees nearly touching underneath because of how much space he took up. Afterward, he helped her into the wagon, those massive hands spanning her waist completely as he lifted her onto the seat. This time he let his palms linger a heartbeat longer than necessary, thumbs resting just beneath the soft curve of her bosom, eyes locked on hers. "You look real pretty today," he said simply, then climbed up beside her, the bench creaking under his weight. The wagon tilted slightly toward him and Bernadette slid naturally against his massive thigh. She didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her hand on his forearm, feeling the solid warmth through the rolled-up sleeve, and they set off down the long dirt track toward town. The ride was peaceful, the prairie wind carrying the scent of sage and new grass. Everett kept one hand on the reins and the other resting lightly on the seat behind her, his fingers occasionally brushing the back of her shoulder in a protective, almost absent way that made her feel cherished. They talked quietly about small things, about the garden coming in strong, about the new calf born last week, about how the mountains looked different every morning. But underneath the easy conversation ran a deeper current, a tension that had been building for weeks now, sweet and aching. When they reached Willow Creek, the town was bustling with the usual Saturday traffic. Folks nodded respectfully at Everett, some of the men tipping their hats, but Bernadette noticed the way eyes widened when they saw her sitting close beside the giant Cowboy. She felt suddenly aware of her full, soft body in the wagon seat, the way her generous hips spread across the wood, the way her bosom rose and fell with each breath. Back east, such stares had made her shrink inside herself. Here, with Everett beside her, she lifted her chin instead. He helped her down right in front of the general store, lifting her effortlessly and setting her on the boardwalk as if she weighed nothing. Then he offered his arm and she took it, her smaller hand resting in the crook of his elbow, feeling the powerful muscle flex beneath her fingers. Inside the store, the owner, Mr. Hargrove, greeted them with a warm smile. "Everett, and this must be your new bride. Heard you'd finally found yourself a wife. Mighty fine to meet you, ma'am." Bernadette felt Everett's arm tighten protectively around hers. "This is Bernadette," he said, voice low but proud. "My wife." The words slipped out so naturally that her breath caught. They weren't married yet, not legally, but in that moment it felt true. Everett didn't correct himself. Instead, he looked down at her with those steel-gray eyes full of quiet certainty, and she felt her cheeks warm with pleasure. They spent a pleasant hour choosing supplies: flour, sugar, coffee beans, a new lantern wick, and several yards of pretty blue gingham for curtains. Bernadette ran her fingers over the fabric, imagining how it would look hanging in the cabin windows, softening the log walls with color. Everett watched her every choice with open admiration, his huge frame towering beside her, making the store aisles feel narrow. When she reached for a bolt of cloth on a high shelf, he simply lifted it down for her, his chest brushing her back as he did. The contact sent heat flooding through her soft curves, and she leaned into him for just a second, breathing in the scent of leather and wood smoke that was so uniquely his. Mr. Hargrove wrapped their purchases and added a small sack of lemon drops with a wink. "For the missus. Every new bride deserves a sweet." Outside again, Everett loaded the wagon, muscles flexing under his shirt as he swung the heavy sacks up kept at ease. A couple of rough-looking cowboys lounged near the saloon, watching them. One of them muttered something Bernadette couldn't hear, but the tone was mocking. Everett's jaw tightened. He stepped closer to her, his massive body becoming a living shield between her and the men. One enormous arm came around her shoulders, pulling her gently against his side so her full figure nestled perfectly under his arm, her head resting just beneath his heart. "Pay them no mind," he murmured against her hair. "They don't know what they looking at." She tilted her face up to him, heart swelling. "Mut to care what they think, not when mut we got you." His steel-gray eyes darkened with something deeper than protection. Right there on the boardwalk, in front of the whole town, he cupped her round cheek in one huge hand, thumb brushing her plump lower lip with infinite tenderness. Good, he said, voice rough, because Motmet never letting you go. The ride home was quieter, charged with everything still unspoken. The sun was lower now, painting the prairie in golden light. Halfway back, Everett pulled the wagon off the main track into a small grove of cottonwoods by the creek. The horses drank while he helped Bernadette down, then spread a thick blanket from the wagon bed on a patch of soft grass. Thought we could sit a spell, he said, almost shy, before we head back to chores. They sat together, her full hips pressing against his massive thigh, her shoulder nestled under his arm. The creek murmured softly beside them, birds called from the branches overhead, and the late afternoon light filtered through the leaves in dappled patterns across her chestnut braid. Everett was quiet for a long time, just holding her close, his big hand resting on the curve of her hip, fingers tracing slow, absent circles over the calico. Finally he spoke, voice low and deep. Mot meant what? Mot said back in town, Bernadette, calling you my wife. Mot no, we haven't stood before a preacher yet, but in my heart you've been mine since the day you stepped off that stagecoach and looked up at me without fear. Mot ve kepanate to make it official soon. If you look have me. Tears pricked her eyes. She turned in his arms, her soft body pressing fully against his hard chest, and looked up at the giant man who had become her whole world. Mot been yours longer than you know, Everett. Mot stopped counting days the moment Mot met you, because suddenly every day felt like it was leading me here, to you, to this. He searched her face, steel gray eyes burning with longing held carefully in check. Mort don't want to rush you. You've been through so much, Mort can wait as long as you need. Bernadette reached up and cupped his bearded jave kepte hot both hands, feeling the strength there and the gentleness he saved only for her. Mot met not rushing. Mot met ready. Kepanate to be your wife in every way. Move kepanate to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old beside you on this land. All of me, soft and full and yours. Something broke open in his expression. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head. His lips brushed hers for the first time, gentle as a summer breeze, testing, asking. The kiss was soft at first, almost reverent, his massive hands cradling her face like she was the most precious thing he had ever held. Then Bernadette sighed against his mouth, and the kiss deepened, slow and sweet and full of 2 years of grief and loneliness finally melting away. She felt the power in him, the way he could have overwhelmed her, but chose instead to cherish her, his huge frame trembling slightly with the effort of holding back. When they finally parted, both breathing harder, Everett rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. Been wanting to do that since the first time Mort lifted you down from the wagon, he admitted, voice husky. Every time Mot touched you, Mot had to remind myself to be careful. You re so soft, so warm, and Mot met so damn big, didn't want to frighten you. You could never frighten me, she whispered, pressing closer so her ample bosom stood fully against his chest. You make me feel safe, desired. Beautiful exactly the way Mot am. He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring, one hand sliding down to rest at the small of her back, pulling her even tighter against him. Her full curves molded perfectly to his hard muscle, her thick thighs brushing his, and the size difference only made the moment more intimate. They stayed like that for a long while, kissing and talking softly between kisses, the creek singing beside them as the sun dipped lower. When they finally climbed back into the wagon, the sky was streaked with rose and lavender. Everett drove with one arm around her now, holding her close the whole way home. At the cabin, he lifted her down and carried her straight inside, not setting her deove kepno until they stood before the fireplace. The fire had burned low, but he stoked it back to life with quick, efficient movements, then turned to her. Supper can wait, he said, voice rough with emotion. Right now, Mort, just want to hold you. He sat in the wide rocking chair and pulled her onto his lap. Bernadette settled against him, her generous weight resting fully on his massive thighs, her head tucked under his chin. His arms wrapped around her completely, one hand splayed across her eto-epte belly, the other stroking her thick braid. They rocked slowly, the chair creaking under their combined weight, and the quiet intimacy wrapped around them like the warmest quilt. "Mut love you, Bernadette," he said into her hair, the words rumbling through his chest and into hers. "Big as Motsem, there's room in my heart for all of you. Every curve, every smile, every quiet strength you carry from those 2 hard years. You healed something in me Mut thought was broken forever." She turned her face up and kissed him again, slow and deep, pouring everything she felt into it. "Mot love you too, Everett. My giant, my protector, my home. Mot met, never counting days again. Only counting the blessings you give me every single morning." They stayed like that until the fire burned low and the stars came out. Everett carried her to bed that night, But instead of leaving her at the curtain, he hesitated. "Stay ve kepite hat me," he whispered. "Not behind the curtain. In my bed, just to sleep. Mot ve kepa note to hold you all night, feel you breathing beside me." Bernadette's heart swelled until she thought it might burst. She nodded, and he carried her to the larger bed against the far wall, the one built extra sturdy for a man his size. He helped her out of her dress with reverent hands, leaving her in her chemise, then stripped down to his long johns. When he lay down beside her, the mattress dipped deeply under his weight, rolling her gently against him. He pulled the quilt over them both and wrapped her in his arms, her full, soft body fitting perfectly into the shelter of his massive frame. One enormous hand rested on her hip, the other stroked her back in slow, soothing circles. For the first time in years, Bernadette fell asleep without a single thought of grief or counting. She slept deeply, safely, wrapped in the protective warmth of the giant cowboy who had become her everything. And as the night wind whispered outside the cabin, Everett lay awake a little longer, listening to her soft breathing, his heart full and steady. The slow burn between them had finally caught flame, warm and bright and true. But they both knew the best was still to come, when they would stand before a preacher and make their promises official. When the mail-order bride and her mountain man giant would begin the next chapter of their forever on this wild Montana land. For now, though, it was enough to be held, to be loved, to be exactly who they were in each other's arms. Bernadette's hand rested on Everett's broad chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart, and she smiled in her sleep. The days ahead stretched out before them, no longer something to count, but something beautiful to live together, one perfect, protected, loving day at a time. The morning light filtered softly through the cabin windows, casting a golden glow across the log walls and the big bed where Bernadette lay nestled against Everett's massive chest. She woke slowly, her full, soft body molded perfectly to his side, one arm draped across the broad expanse of his ribs and her thick chestnut braid spilling over his shoulder like a silken rope. For a long moment she simply breathed him in, the warm scent of wood smoke and leather and honest man that had become her favorite smell in the world. His enormous arm was curled around her waist, hands splayed possessively yet gently over the rounded curve of her hip, holding her close as if even in sleep he refused to let her drift away. The size of him still took her breath away. 6 feet 10 inches of solid, protective muscle wrapped around her generous 240-pound frame, like she was the most delicate thing he had ever touched. Everett stirred then, steel-gray eyes opening to find her already watching him. A slow, sleepy smile curved beneath his dark beard, and his hand tightened just a fraction on her hip, thumb-stroking the soft fabric of her chemise. "Mornin', my love," he rumbled, voice deep and rough with sleep. "Didn't dream you up after all. You were really here in my bed, all warm and soft in mine." Bernadette felt her cheeks flush with pleasure, and she pressed closer, her ample bosom resting fully against him. "Mote am," she whispered, "and mote don't ever want to wake up anywhere else." She tilted her face up, and he met her halfway, kissing her slow and deep, the kind of kiss that started gentle and grew hungry, his massive hand sliding up her back to cradle the nape of her neck. When they finally parted, she was breathing faster, heart hammering against her ribs. Everett last night was the first time in 2 years Mut didn't wake up reaching for that old journal. Mutiuete reached for you instead. He rolled carefully onto his side so he could look down at her, his huge frame making the sturdy bed creak. One finger traced the plump curve of her cheek, then down along her jaw. "Then Mort reckon it's time we make this official," he said quietly. "No more sleeping separate, no more waiting. Mort want you as my wife before God in this whole territory. We can ride into Willow Creek today, talk to the preacher. If he is free, we could be married by the end of the week. Simple and right here on our land, just us and whoever wants to come witness it." Tears of joy pricked her eyes. She reached up and cupped his bearded Java Kepite hat, both hands, feeling the strength of the man who had chosen her exactly as she was. "Yes," she breathed. 1,000 times yes. Mut stopped counting days the moment Mut met you, Everett. Now Mut just want to start counting the years we Luglung have together. He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring, then reluctantly pulled back with a low groan. "If Mort keep kissing you like that, we Luglung never get out of this bed today," he said, voice husky. "And much as Mort like that, Mort wants you standing beside me as my wife proper, before Mort carry you back here for good." He sat up, the mattress dipping deeply under his weight, and swung his long legs over the side. When he stood, he towered over the bed, broad shoulders blocking the morning light, then reached down and lifted her effortlessly into his arms, chemise and all. Bernadette laughed softly as her bare feet left the floor, her full curves pressed tight to his bare chest. He carried her across the cabin like she weighed nothing, setting her gently on the rug by the stove so she could dress while he built up the fire. They ate a quick breakfast together, stealing glances and soft touches across the table. Every time her hand brushed his, he turned his palm up so their fingers could link, her smaller ones disappearing completely inside his massive grip. After the dishes were done, he helped her into the wagon again, hands spanning her waist as he lifted her high onto the seat. This time he didn't let go right away. He stood there on the ground looking up at her steel-gray eyes full of quiet wonder. "You re the prettiest thing these mountains have ever seen," he told her, full and soft and strong all at once. "Don't know what I did to deserve you stepping off that stagecoach, but Mort meant never letting you go." The ride into Willow Creek passed in a haze of sunlight and sweet anticipation. Everett kept one arm around her the whole way, her head resting against his shoulder while the prairie rolled by in waves of green and gold. When they reached town, he helped her down in front of the small white church, and they found the preacher, an older man with kind eyes, sweeping the front steps. Everett explained their wish in his quiet, straightforward way, and the preacher smiled wide. "Been hoping you'd come in soon," he said. "The whole town's been talking about how that giant cowboy finally found himself a wife. We can do the ceremony right here this Saturday if that suits you both. Simple and sweet, the way the good Lord intended." They left the church with light hearts and headed straight to the general store. Bernadette chose a length of soft ivory lace for a simple veil and a pretty blue ribbon to tie back her hair. Everett insisted on buying her a new dress length in pale green calico that would hug her generous curves just right. "Want you to feel beautiful standing beside me," he said when she tried to protest the expense, "and you will be. You already are." Mr. Hargrove wrapped everything kept to had extra care and added another sack of lemon drops for the bride-to-be. On the way home, the sky began to darken unexpectedly, heavy clouds rolling in from the mountains. The wind picked up, whipping at Bernadette's braid and tugging at her skirt. Everett frowned and urged the horses faster, one big arm pulling her tighter against him. "Storm's coming quicker than mo't like," he muttered. "We look make it, but we might get wet." They were halfway home when the rain hit, sudden and driving. The wagon wheels slipped in the rapidly forming mud, and one of the horses shied at a flash of lightning. Bernadette gasped as the wagon lurched. Everett's massive arm clamped around her instantly, anchoring her to his side so she wouldn't slide. "Mo've got you," he said, voice steady, even as rain poured down his dark hair and soaked his shirt. With one hand he kept control of the reins, the other holding her firmly. When the wagon hit a deep rut and tilted dangerously, he didn't hesitate. He wrapped both arms around her, lifted her clean out of the seat, and held her against his chest while he guided the horses with his knees and sheer strength. Her full, soft body was pressed completely to him, soaked calico clinging to every curve, but she felt utterly safe inside the shelter of his enormous frame. They reached the cabin just as the worst of the storm broke. Everett carried her inside without setting her down, boots leaving marks across the floor. He kicked the door shut behind them and only then lowered her gently onto the rug by the fireplace. "Stay right here," he told her, already stripping off his wet shirt. The sight of his bare chest, all-powerful muscle and dark hair, made her breath catch even through her shivering. He built the fire high with quick, efficient movements, then fetched thick towels and wrapped one around her shoulders, rubbing her arms and back to warm her. His huge hands moved with such care over her full figure, drying her neck, her plump cheeks, even kneeling to dry her legs where the wet skirt clung to her thick thighs. "You re-trembling," he murmured, voice rough with worry. "Come here." He sat on the wide bench and pulled her onto his lap again, wrapping her completely in his arms and the towel and his own body heat. Bernadette burrowed against him, her cheek pressed to the steady thump of his heart. The storm howled outside, rain lashing the windows, but inside it was only the crackle of the fire and the two of them breathing together. "Mort was never scared," she whispered against his skin. "Not even for a second, because Mort knew you'd keep me safe." Everett's arms tightened around her. "Always will," he promised, whether it storms or bears or the ghosts of old grief. "You re my wife in every way that matters already, Bernadette. Saturday duete makes it official for the world to see." He tilted her chin up and kissed her, slow and deep, tasting rain and love and the future they were building. The kiss went on until they were both breathing hard and the fire had chased every chill from her body. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Mot love you," he said simply. "Big as mot am, clumsy as mot can be, mot love you with everything mot got." "Mot love you too," she answered, voice thick with emotion. "My giant, my protector, the man who made me stop counting days and start living them instead." They spent the rest of the storm day wrapped up together, talking quietly about the wedding, about the life they wanted, about the children they hoped would fill the cabin with laughter one day. Everett's hands never stopped touching her, gentle strokes down her back, over the soft roundness of her belly, along the generous curve of her hip, learning every in of her the way a man learns the land he means to cherish forever. Bernadette explored him in return, tracing the powerful lines of his shoulders, the thick muscles of his arms, marveling at how someone so immense could be so endlessly tender. When the rain finally eased to a soft drizzle, they cooked supper together, moving around the kitchen in the easy rhythm they had found. He lifted her again to reach the high shelf, and this time when he set her down, he didn't step back. He simply held her there against the counter, kissing her until the stew nearly boiled over, and they both laughed like children. That night he carried her to bed early, the big sturdy bed that now felt like theirs instead of his. He helped her out of her damp dress-veil-kept hat reverent hands, leaving her in her chemise, then stripped down himself and pulled her close under the quilts. They lay facing each other, her full, soft body fitting perfectly into the curve of his massive frame. One of his enormous hands rested on the small of her back, the other stroked her thick braid as it lay across her shoulder. "Saturday feels a lifetime away," he murmured against her forehead. Bernadette smiled in the darkness and pressed a kiss to the center of his chest. "Then let's make the waiting sweet," she whispered. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, hearts beating in time while the last of the rain whispered against the roof. Outside, the Montana night was cool and wild, but inside the cabin, two souls who had once counted lonely days had found a hot other and built something unbreakable. The giant cowboy and his full-figured mail-order bride were only hours away from standing before a preacher and promising forever in front of God and the mountains that had brought them together. And as sleep claimed them both, Bernadette's last conscious thought was simple and true. She had finally stopped counting because every single day from now on would be one worth living fully in the arms of the man who loved her exactly as she was, soft curves, tender heart, and all. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in soft Montana sunlight, the kind that promised new beginnings and chased away every last shadow of the past. Bernadette woke in the big sturdy bed with Everett's massive arms still curled protectively around her full figure, his hand resting warm and heavy on the soft curve of her hip. She lay there for a long moment, simply breathing him in, feeling the steady rise and fall of his broad chest beneath her cheek, the way her generous curves molded perfectly against his hard muscle. 240 pounds of soft, womanly warmth tucked safely into the shelter of a 6'10" giant who had chosen her exactly as she was. For the first time in her life, she felt no need to apologize for taking up space. Here in his arms, every inch of her was cherished. Everett stirred, steel-gray eyes opening to find her already smiling up at him. "Today's the day," he rumbled, voice deep and full of quiet joy. His enormous hand slid up her side, thumb brushing the underside of her ample bosom with reverent care. "My beautiful bride, can't believe you were really going to stand beside me and say yes in front of God and everybody." She pressed closer, her thick chestnut braid spilling across his shoulder. "Mo've been saying yes to you in my heart since the moment you lifted me down from that stagecoach," she whispered. "Today just makes it official." He kissed her then, slow and deep, the kind of kiss that spoke of promises kept and years yet to come. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing harder, eyes dark with longing held carefully in check. "If Mort keep kissing you like that, we look never make it to the church," he said with a low chuckle, "and Mort want you as my wife proper, before Mort carry you back here, and never let you out of this bed again." He sat up, the mattress dipping deeply under his weight, then reached down and lifted her effortlessly into his arms, chemise and all. Bernadette laughed softly as her bare feet left the floor, her full body pressed tight to his bare chest while he carried her across the cabin to help her dress. They prepared together in the golden morning light. Bernadette slipped into the new pale green calico dress he had bought her, the fabric hugging her generous bosom, rounded belly, and wide hips with flattering grace. She tied the pretty blue ribbon in her thick chestnut hair and pinned the soft ivory lace veil in place. Everett watched her every movement from across the room, his steel-gray eyes full of wonder and pride. He dressed in his best dark wool trousers and a crisp white shirt that stretched across his massive shoulders. The sleeves rolled up to show the powerful forearms that had lifted her, protected her, and held her through every storm. When she was ready, he crossed the room in 2 long strides and cupped her round face in both huge hands. "You're the most beautiful thing Medvev ever seen," he said simply. "Soft and strong and mine. Let's go make this forever." The wagon ride to Willow Creek felt like a dream. Everett kept one arm around her the whole way, her head resting against his shoulder while the prairie bloomed around them in wildflowers and new grass. When they reached the small white church, the preacher was waiting on the steps with a handful of townsfolk who had come to witness the giant cowboy finally claiming his mail-order bride. Mr. Hargrove from the general store was there, along with the 2 ranch hands who worked the far pasture, and a few curious women who had heard the story of the full-figured widow who had stolen the heart of the biggest man in the territory. Everett helped her down from the wagon with those massive hands spanning her waist completely, then offered his arm. They walked up the aisle together, her smaller hand resting in the crook of his elbow, feeling the powerful muscle flex beneath her fingers. The church was simple and sunlit, wildflowers in jars on the windowsills, and the preacher stood at the front with an open Bible and a kind smile. Everett towered beside her, his broad shoulders filling the space, yet he looked down at her with such tenderness that the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The vows came slow and heartfelt. Everett went first, his deep rumbling voice filling the little church like distant thunder wrapped in velvet. "Bernadette, from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, Motkano Eve kept my lonely days were over. You came to me full of quiet strength and soft curves and a heart that had counted too many empty days. Mot promised to protect you every single sunrise, to lift you when the ground gets slippery, to hold you through every storm and every quiet night. Mot promised to love every generous inch of you exactly as you are, to build a life with you on this land, to fill our cabin with laughter and children, and love so big it matches the mountains watching over us. You healed me. My love, today Mot give you all of me, big and clumsy and yours forever." Tears slipped down Bernadette's plump cheeks as she looked up at the giant man who had become her everything. Her voice was soft but steady. "Everett, you found me when Mot was still counting days to hold on to my grief. You saw me, all of me, soft and full and carrying the weight of loss, and you made me feel beautiful instead of broken. Mot promised to stand beside you through every hard winter and every sweet spring, to cook your favorite meals and laugh with you by the fire, to let you lift me and protect me while Mot remind you every day that your strength is matched by the gentlest heart Mot ever known. Mot stopped counting the moment Mot met you because every day with you is one worth living fully. Mot give you all of me, every curve, every smile, every quiet resilience, forever and always." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Everett wait for permission. He scooped her up right there in front of everyone, lifting her effortlessly into his arms so her full figure nestled perfectly against his massive chest. The small crowd cheered as he carried his bride down the aisle and out into the bright Montana sunshine. He didn't set her down until they reached the wagon where he kissed her long and deep, pouring 2 years of loneliness and weeks of slow-burning love into the single moment. The ride home was filled with laughter and stolen kisses. At the cabin, Everett had prepared a simple wedding supper the night before, but neither of them cared much about food right then. He carried her straight over the threshold, kicking the door shut behind them, and only set her down in the center of the room so he could look at her properly as his wife. "Mrs. Everett," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Sounds right, doesn't it?" "It sounds perfect," she whispered. He pulled her close again, kissing her until they were both breathless. Then, with infinite care, he began to undress her, huge hands gentle on every button and ribbon, reverent as he revealed each soft inch of her full-figured body. When she stood before him in nothing but her chemise, he lifted her again and carried her to their bed, laying her down like she was the most precious gift he had ever received. He stripped off his Ove Kepna clothes and joined her, the mattress dipping deeply under his weight so she rolled naturally into his arms. Their bodies came together slow and sweet, his massive frame covering hers protectively, every powerful muscle trembling with the effort of holding back until she was ready. Bernadette welcomed him with open arms and an open heart, her generous curves molding perfectly to his hard strength, the size difference only making the intimacy deeper, more complete. He moved Vekepte at her like the land itself, steady and powerful yet endlessly tender, whispering love against her skin, kissing every place she had once felt ashamed of until she felt only desired and beautiful and wholly his. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilt, her head on his chest, his enormous hand stroking slow circles on her soft belly. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting their skin in gold. "No more counting days," she murmured against his heartbeat. "Only counting blessings," he answered, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. And Mott V got more than Mott ever dreamed. The weeks that followed wove their love deeper into the fabric of the homestead. The garden flourished under Bernadette's gentle hands, while Everett's powerful ones built a cradle, just in case the good Lord blessed them soon. They rode the land together, her mare keeping easy pace beside his big draft horse, his arm always ready to steady her. When another late storm rolled in, he carried her to the barn and back without hesitation, sheltering her completely under his massive frame. At night they fell asleep wrapped in each other, her full soft body fitting perfectly into the curve of his, safe and loved beyond measure. One crisp autumn evening, almost a year later, Bernadette stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in fiery orange and purple. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their first child was growing strong and healthy. Everett came up behind her, wrapping his enormous arms around her from behind, one huge hand splaying protectively over their unborn baby. He rested his chin on top of her head, breathing her in. "Look at what we've built," he whispered. "From two lonely souls counting empty days to this. A home, a family, a love big enough to fill the whole territory." Bernadette leaned back against his broad chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. "You gave me back my life, Everett. You taught me that Mort didn't have to be small to be loved, that my size, my softness, my strength were all exactly right for the man who was big enough to hold it all." He turned her in his arms and kissed her slow and deep, the same way he had on their wedding day, only now it carried the weight of shared seasons and growing dreams. When they parted, he lifted her effortlessly, carrying her inside to the fire they had built together. The cabin was warm with lamplight and the scent of supper simmering on the stove. Their life stretched out before them, filled with more sunrises than either of them could ever count, each one brighter because they faced it side by side. And so the lonely widow and the giant cowboy lived out their days on that Montana homestead, their love a quiet, powerful thing that healed old wounds and made new ones impossible. She never picked up that little leather journal again. The days no longer needed counting. They were simply lived, fully and joyfully, in the protective arms of the man who had shown her that sometimes the greatest healing comes when a giant chooses to be gentle, and a full-figured woman finally believes she is exactly enough. Friends, if you stayed with us through every heartfelt moment of Bernadette and Everett's story here on Cowboy Ironheart, then you already know the truth this tale carries in its bones. Sometimes the deepest love isn't teat loud or flashy. Sometimes it arrives on a dusty stagecoach in the form of an unexpected woman who thinks she's broken, and a towering man who knows that real strength looks a lot like tenderness. It grows in quiet mornings over coffee, in strong hands that lift without crushing, in nights where two hearts finally stop counting losses and start building forever. Let this story remind you that no matter how many days you've counted in sorrow, there's always a new sunrise waiting ve kep. It's someone who sees you exactly as you are and calls you home. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment and educational purposes. The characters, events, and situations in this story are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. This content was created with the aid of AI tools and has been carefully edited by the team at Cowboy Ironheart, all rights reserved.